All right, I think we'll get started there. First off, thanks so much to everybody for coming out. We're very excited to have you here. This week is a little bit of a deviation from our usual Monday nights on our topic. We're very lucky to have Anna Stefik, our divisional superintendent here at 176, and Nick Hume, who's a provincial staff officer and also a member of Div 176 here, presenting separate presentations from different rooms of the same house. So they'll be presenting about St. John Ambulance, the history through the war effort, and I'm sure it'll ramble into a few other topics that we haven't discussed yet before. Just in case anybody here is new tonight, during the presentations, we keep everybody's microphones muted and videos off except for the presenter. Just allows the focus to stay right on the presenter. Similarly, as questions come up, we ask you please just put them into the chat box. And then we also ask that you leave the questions in the chat box for our presenters there. A lot of the time it just helps keep the answers on topic, relevant, and accurate. Towards the end of the presentation, we will have some time for just an open question and answer as well. If you have questions related to the topic that maybe didn't quite get up with a great chance to ask during the presentation, we will also take a couple pauses throughout the presentation to answer questions as they come in. With that, I'll turn it over to Anna here.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, David. Just briefly about me for those who I have not met yet. I am the one that sends you all the emails for these training sessions. As David mentioned, I am currently serving as the Divisional Superintendent for Division 176 in Victoria. I've been with the division for about 7 years. I originally joined looking for something else to do, a new hobby, and this is a hobby that eventually spun out of control. I now work as a primary care paramedic for the ambulance service. In my pre-St. John life, I did my undergraduate degree in history, and World War I was very much an area of study for me, an area of interest for me. I do not claim to be an expert on this topic whatsoever, but I will do my best to answer any questions that may come up. So yeah, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of St. John Ambulance and the First World War. This is a very large topic, so I've kind of chosen a few areas to kind of zone in on or zoom in on to talk about, just so that everyone has a little bit of knowledge about the history of what we did during the First World War. This is very much going to be from the Canadian perspective, with some local history here from Victoria as well. So I'm actually going to stop my video because I have all of my notes spread out around me and I don't want my face to be distracting as we go through this. Okay, so to start, hopefully my slides move. Okay, so a little bit of background before we begin. When the First World War broke out in 1914, St. John Ambulance was still relatively new in Canada. It had really only been around for about 30 years. There were still branches being set up in the different provinces. Here in BC, we got our start in 1911 with the opening of the Victoria branch. So in 1914, we were brand new, essentially. From its start, St. John Ambulance was growing in popularity with its courses in first aid and home nursing. And with the war, they became far more popular as people were searching for ways to learn first aid. The outbreak of the war gave St. John Ambulance members the opportunity to serve their king and country under the banner of the Maltese Cross. And in this presentation, I'll discuss a few areas of where we helped. As I mentioned, this is a massive topic. We could have multiple lectures from this, so I've just kind of chosen 3 areas to talk about. Before we dive in, you should know what the Joint War Committee was. Before the start of the war, St. John Ambulance and the Red Cross had a lot of similarities in the work that they did. They did a lot of training, fundraising, relief work. The Red Cross was known for its work during war times, and St. John was known for its work during peacetime. But a lot of their work did overlap. When the war broke out in 1914, it was quickly realized that it was in the best interests of those that they served that St. John and the Red Cross enter an agreement to work together so that they could pool their resources and become more efficient. The main goal was to prevent duplication of work and to prevent competition for funds and to maximize the efforts for those that were working for both of these organizations. It was decided that the Joint War Committee would be made up of 50% Red Cross representatives and 50% St. John representatives. The committee had the power to collect money on behalf of the two organizations, decide the scope to which they would act. It would represent them both in communications with the government, and it would control expenditures of the joint funds of St. John and the Red Cross when it came to war work. So the Red Cross was already internationally recognized through various Geneva Conventions. It had a history of working in war zones. So it was designated as the umbrella organization under which St. John would operate. In Canada, the Department of Militia and Defence oversaw the joining of the Canadian Red Cross Society and St. John under the National Relief Committee. And this took place in August of 1914. So the Department of Militia, it would identify where help was needed. It would approach the Joint Committee, and then the Red Cross would do a bunch of fundraising. It would collect and transport materials and personnel. And St. John Ambulance was left to concentrate on training and the organization of voluntary aid detachments. So when you look through some of the historical materials of this time, you will often see Joint War Committee, you will see posters and releases with a Red Cross and a Maltese Cross together. That was that organization when they joined together. You will notice that in Canada, the two organizations came together first in August of 1914, and then Britain followed suit in October of 1914. And some of the reasons are that a lot of the high-ups in government here in Canada were patrons of both St. John and the Red Cross. So those two organizations came together a whole lot more easily than elsewhere. Okay, so we'll jump into one of the major things that St. John Ambulance here in Canada did. That was in the field of training. So when the war broke out, it was quickly realized just how important first aid training would be for those serving on the front lines. Sir Lewis Davies, the then president of the St. John Ambulance Association, was quoted as saying, "We are sending 250,000 of the best blood of Canada across the seas to defend our liberties and our country, and we ought to see to it that every man, as far as possible, is instructed in first aid." So working with the Department of Militia and Defence, a plan was devised to supply qualified St. John instructors to train members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. These St. John instructors were appointed with the rank and pay of quartermaster sergeants in the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and the instructors would be assigned to a division or military district and work to train every officer, NCO, soldier, so that they would have a general knowledge of first aid before they went off to fight. The men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were given an accelerated course. There was not much time to go through the full length of course if they were amping up to get deployed. So the course was tailored to things that they would encounter in the field, such as management of fractures, dislocations, sprains, hemorrhage control, bandaging, artificial respiration, how to deal with insensibility or unconsciousness, and different methods of carrying. Each soldier was given a condensed copy of Cantley's First Aid to the Injured books. For those of us at St. John who collect them, there's those little black books with the Maltese cross on them. So that was condensed so that one could carry it in their pockets and study it on their own time. And by the end of the war, the Department of Militia and Defense printed 250,000 copies of that book. And I have a little picture here on this slide taken from a 1915 version, which demonstrated how to carry your patients. By the end of the war, approximately 200,000 members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force had been trained in first aid. Not included in these numbers were the medics and stretcher bearers of the Newfoundland Regiment, who also underwent St. John training. I'm sorry, I do not have stats on the Newfoundlanders, but they also took part in this training process. So this is a little article that I pulled up from the Daily Colonist, which was, I guess, the precursor to the Times Colonist here in Victoria. This is an article from 1915. And it says, for the instruction in first aid, provision being made for the training of men of units of the Expeditionary Forces by St. John Ambulance. And the article goes on and it talks about a lot of the things that I just mentioned, but there was one line in there that was my favorite. And it said, wherever a unit is being trained, there a St. John man will be sent. So by all accounts, this was a very popular training program, and the British kind of looked at what the Canadians did, and there were all these accounts of soldiers using their first aid training on the fields, and they too employed St. John Ambulance to train some of their frontline units. Okay, break for questions. I'm gonna have a handful of breaks of questions because I am talking a lot. So just to kind of control the flow of this, we'll do questions. Don't really see anything coming up in the chat, so we'll continue on to the next topic. Okay. Voluntary Aid Detachment. So one of the most visible contributions made by St. John Ambulance during the war was the provision of voluntary aid detachments, which largely served in hospitals and convalescent homes as a supplement to medical personnel. They assisted the overworked medical and nursing staff in caring for thousands of injured and sick servicemen. VADs that deployed overseas would face some of the same dangers and hardships that soldiers, nurses, doctors, all those people working near the front lines, they were there too, and they had similar experiences. Who were the VADs? So they could, I guess, most simply be described as nursing assistants. They were civilians who were trained in first aid and home nursing, whereas women who were professionally trained as nurses, they went to school to become nurses. Those women were expected to enlist with the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Those women would have been given the rank of a lieutenant, and they were very much military personnel. They weren't quite eligible to become a VAD. Those positions were civilians who were volunteering to help. Joining a voluntary aid detachment was kind of a quick way into service for women, where men would enlist in the Army, get trained and deploy. For a woman to deploy, one of the ways she would do that would be going through that lengthy nursing education, joining the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and then deploying. So a voluntary aid detachment, you would just take a first aid course, a home nursing course, get accepted to wherever you were going, and that was your way into service. In the early years of the war, there was a bit of hesitation about sending civilian volunteers into hospitals overseas. This was well exemplified by the matron-in-chief of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, Major Marjorie MacDonald. She felt there was an enormous risk into accepting, quote, untrained volunteers. She worried that VADs had no rank or salary, so they could not be controlled by either. And VADs lacked the experience with hierarchical hospital protocol that demanded an unquestioned obedience. She worried that VADs might undermine the efficiency and status of the regular nursing staff. Major MacDonald was not alone in this opinion, and from what I've read, her opinion didn't change much throughout the war. She saw St. John essentially as the Band-Aid brigade who would go and undermine these trained nurses. But as casualties began to mount, hospitals became more and more overworked. It became quite clear that more help was required, so VADs became an accepted part of the medical system. The VADs who were kind of joining these detachments, they were typically Anglo-Protestant. They would have been upper middle class. They were unmarried women in their mid-20s to early 30s in age. Many of them had higher education. They held university degrees, and they were employed in those upper and middle class professions. These were women who could afford to pay for training, and they had enough time and money to work for little or no income. These women would have left their employment or their society lives to undertake unpaid VAD service. I have another excerpt from the Daily Colonist, this time from January 13th, 1918. This is an article that talked about VADs deploying overseas, and it talked about the qualifications that units were looking for before a woman got accepted. So I'll just read you a quick excerpt from that. The article is called Exacting Qualifications. The qualifications for acceptance with the St. John Ambulance Brigade overseas are very exacting. VAD probationers must be British subjects, British by birth, aged 23 to 38 years, good education, good health, certificate of physical fitness for active service must be given by surgeon, and there must also be certificate of inoculation. There must be no organic disease, absence of varicose veins, flat feet, or other deformity, and some hospital experience is desirable. Applicants will not be accepted unless in possession of first aid and home nursing certificates, and no one will be accepted who is unwilling to give service for the duration of the war in hospitals in England. It is particularly interesting to note the scale of pay, showing that girls who offer themselves to voluntary work are moved by patriotic rather than commercial motives. Transportation to London and return home to Canada is provided, but St. John Ambulance will not accept liability for any illness or accident. These are stern conditions, and the fact that so many have come forward and offered themselves in full knowledge of the facts is proof of the fine spirit which characterizes the Voluntary Aid Detachment. So when you did become a volunteer with one of these detachments, there were different roles you could take on. If you didn't have a first aid certificate, you could hold a non-medical role. You could be a housemaid, a cook, cleaner, stenographer, secretary, and so on. Many VADs were deployed domestically in hospitals and convalescent homes here in Canada. Some VADs went to train in the Military School of Orthopedic Surgery and Physiotherapy in Toronto. These VADs would deploy to hospitals and convalescent homes where they would assist in physiotherapy work. And the largest and most known group of VADs were the nursing members. These were women who assisted trained nurses in taking care of the sick and wounded, and their tasks included things like applying and changing dressings and bandages. They would make beds, they would prepare meals, they would ensure cleanliness of the patient environment, and they were also trained to turn any building into a makeshift hospital. Before becoming a nursing assistant, the VAD candidate would have to complete a course in first aid and home nursing. So I've pulled up the syllabus from a first aid course from the time. And you can see that they would learn about fractures and fracture management. They practiced a whole bunch of times about triangular bandages in their application. They would do hemorrhage control, foreign body obstructions. They would talk about insensibility, which was, from my understanding, the word for unconsciousness or decreased consciousness. They would talk about poisoning. There were first aid lectures for males only, as you can see by the 5th lecture, which had a lot more of the heavy lifting. And the 5th lecture for women only talked about preparation for reception of accident cases, some lifting and carrying, preparation for surgeons, removal of clothing. And then the home nursing syllabus trained VADs in nursing basics. So things like making bed, bathing patients, pulse checks, temperature checks, diet preparation, feeding techniques, some basic anatomy and physiology. What's interesting is they would also be trained in infections and disinfection techniques and how to quarantine a patient, which came very useful towards the end of the war when we started seeing cases of the Spanish flu. These courses, or these lectures that they're separated into, they would last 5 to 6 weeks per course, and each lecture would take 10 to 12 hours of lessons and demonstrations. All in all, to become a trained VAD took about 3 months. All right, and we'll jump into some of the ways VADs served. So early on in the war, a lot of these VADs mostly served domestically. They would be assigned to a military hospital in their town or convalescent homes where soldiers would be recovering. Convalescent homes were where a serviceman would go once he was discharged from the hospital, but still required care but didn't need active treatment. The first voluntary aid detachments in Canada were set up in 1915 in Halifax and Quebec City. These were ports of re-entry for soldiers who were coming back home from Europe. If a soldier was requiring care, he would be met by a VAD whichever port they were coming back into, and she would travel with them to a hospital or a convalescent home. The first VAD or voluntary aid detachment in Victoria was also organized in 1915. It was under the command of Mrs. Charles E. Wilson, and this unit consisted of 28 members. Also in 1915, there was a house that was acquired from the city at 1421 Stadacona Avenue, and it was turned into a 30-bed convalescent homes. It had electric lights, it had fireplaces in many of the rooms, it had large grounds for exercise, and it would see patients. And this was kind of the place where a lot of these Victoria VADs got their practice before moving on to other areas of service. In 1917, this Victoria detachment was officially registered as a women's nursing division of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. And it was called Division 34. You'll hear about it a little bit later. I've managed to find a hospital in the BC archives of this house. It no longer exists. That whole street, or that stretch of the street, is all apartment buildings now. So more about the home front. When the Spanish flu arrived in BC, that particular convalescent home that had been run by that Victoria VAD group was then turned into a hospital for servicemen who had the flu. From newspaper accounts, it filled up to capacity within 5 days of reopening. The article I've included here is from Thursday, October 17th, 1918. So this was a Thursday, and the article writes that the hospital opened on the Saturday. So within 5 days, it was full. It was staffed by 2 nurses, 1 matron, and 3 VADs day and night. And this particular article is calling for more nurses and more VADs to come help because of how quickly it filled up and how well used this facility was. And during the influenza pandemic, VADs were sought to work at the military hospital or the naval hospital in Esquimalt, and there was also an isolation hospital in the city. So that was here in Victoria. I'd imagine that VADs in other areas, Vancouver, a lot of the larger city centers, they would also work in similar situations as the ones I have presented here from Victoria. With that, we'll slide into international service. So opportunities did come up for Canadian VADs to go overseas and serve in Europe. The first group of Canadian VADs consisted of 60 women. They came from all over the country, and many of these volunteers already had experience serving in convalescent homes and military hospitals domestically. 50 of these women were sent to different military hospitals in England. 10 of them were immediately sent over to hospitals in France. Most VADs would serve in based hospitals where they cleaned and bandaged wounds, sterilized medical equipment, bathed patients, prepared their meals, made their beds, cleaned the wards, and prepared bodies for the mortuary. It is... Sorry, I've got someone's mic coming up. One sec. Okay, so useful to remember that a lot of these VADs would have been coming from the upper levels of society. Many of them would never have set foot inside a hospital, let alone care for the sick and wounded. When these women arrived at their posted hospital, any romantic notion of nursing they had were pretty soon gone. They were met by the grim reality of the shattered bodies, the stench, the gasping of men poisoned by mustard gas, the screams of shell-shocked soldiers. The work took a heavy emotional and physical toll on the VADs. Day after day, they cared for injured soldiers who arrived with severed limbs, gunshot wounds, countless other injuries. For patients who were too badly injured, attending VADs could only ease their pain while waiting for them to die. A lot of these hospitals were chronically understaffed, and personnel had to do their best to treat the convoys of wounded soldiers brought in from the front lines. The VADs would work long hours and had little time off, usually 1 half day off each week and 1 full day off each month. I'd like to read you a quote by Vera Britton, who was a VAD in the field hospital in Étampes. She eventually wrote a book about her experience there titled A Testament of Youth, and this quote is from that book. "I am a sister VAD and an orderly all in one. Quite apart from nursing, I have stoked the fire all night, done 2 or 3 rounds of bedpans and kept the kettles going, and prepared feeds on exceedingly black oil stoves. I feel as if I've been dragged through the gutter. Possibly, acute surgical is the heaviest type of work there is, more wearing than anything else on earth. You are kept on the go the whole time, but in the end, there seems to be nothing definite to show for it, except that one or two are still alive that might otherwise be dead. The work in the military hospitals was undoubtedly traumatic. Some VADs were overwhelmed by the work and returned home. Many others, however, were able to adapt and build resiliency and relationships. Many VADs in their post-war writings described how the work gave them a deep sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. The turn of the 20th century was a time when women's roles were largely in the domestic sphere, and here they were making these significant contributions to the war effort. A few stats for you before we move on to the next topic. So in Canada, the largest numbers of VADs came from Ontario and Quebec. The next came from Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and BC. I am counting Newfoundland in the Canadian stats, even though they were kind of their own thing at this time. Canada also provided the largest contingent of VADs to serve, excluding the ones from Britain. By the war's end, 432 women had served overseas. So altogether, I have some stats about St. John Ambulance VADs from the British Empire. So this counts Britain, Canada, Australia, etc. So a total of 45,089 VADs served during the war. 15,156 were men, 30,073 were women. I do not actually have much information on male VADs. They did exist. They did have their own units that served. From all the reading that I've done, it talks about women. I'd imagine these were men who were ineligible to serve in the army, so they could join a VAD. But like I said, there's not too much on them. So at the end of the war, we ended up with 498 names of VADs on the Roll of Honor. 6 of them are Canadian from the 22 Canadian names on the Roll of Honor. And this is the Roll of Honor of St. John Ambulance. So this would have been people who were members of St. John. The 22 Canadians were members who enlisted in the army, served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and the VAD volunteers and the staff of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, so on and so forth. So these were also members of St. John, these 22 names, and 6 of them died in their service as VADs. Questions? That was a big topic. I'll pull up the chat really quickly. Dave, I don't know if there was
yeah, so two
come
common questions. First off, from Mike here, were Canadians considered to be British? Like was it British subjects or actual British citizens?
So I think what they mean by that is your kind of Anglo-Saxon idea of British subject. So
subjects of the empire?
Yeah, subject of the empire. So if you say were a recent immigrant from Eastern Europe and you didn't speak English, I don't think you would be the ideal candidate. So you would be your typical, like I said, Anglo-Protestant white woman.
Awesome. And then the second question we had was, where did the first aid instructions included in the shortened first aid to the injured originate from?
I'd imagine, so Cantley wrote the first aid to the injured books that we see, and the excerpts were also from that book. So I'd imagine they took whatever year's version they were using and took the parts that they found useful.
I might, this is Nick Hume talking. I might be able to throw a little bit of light on that, Anna, if you want me to jump in really fast.
Jump in.
So the first aid to the injured book dates back to the mid-late 1800s, and the first edition was actually first published by Surgeon Major Peter Shepherd in the United Kingdom, who created the first handbook used by the St. John Ambulance Association in 1878, about a year before his death. Since then, the first aid to the injured book has been in sort of a state of, or was for a very long time, for about 60 or 70 years, in a state of fairly constant evolution, with new editions every year or two. Cantley sort of took things over, I think, in the 1880s after Shepherd's death, but I might be mistaken on that. I'd have to check a couple of sources. But that's the short version. Is it actually dates back to the first edition being 1878, 1877, somewhere in there, by Peter Shepherd. And this is, incidentally, this is before St. John was actually recognized by the Crown, before St. John was recognized by Queen Victoria. This is sort of going back to the work of the order proper, as the St. John Ambulance Association before they got all their royal recognition from the Commonwealth. But I hope that answers the question a little bit, at least.
All right, I don't see any other questions, so we'll move on to the next topic. I'm sorry, I've kind of compressed all of VADs into this one few minute presentation. There was a lot of work that they did. I hope I highlighted some of the major stuff. Okay, so next we'll talk about St. John Ambulance Hospitals. So that was another thing St. John did. It operated hospitals and convalescent homes. By the end of 1915, St. John Ambulance was operating 150 hospitals in England. So the term hospital isn't what you would think of it in modern times. They were not on the scale of your Victoria General Hospital or anything. A lot of the times these would be makeshift hospitals in former schools or houses, and they would set them up to function as medical facilities. So the St. John hospitals were staffed entirely by St. John members. And going back to our Joint War Committee, the Red Cross also had hospitals, and they were staffed by a mix of St. John Ambulance and Red Cross staff. The Red Cross also had their own VAD units. Interestingly enough, the St. John VAD units in Canada were trained by St. John. But altogether, St. John ended up taking the lead on the VAD movement in Canada. In France, there were 9 Red Cross hospitals, which were staffed by, again, Red Cross and St. John personnel, mostly VADs. And then St. John had its own hospital in France, which had 520 beds to start and then expanded. So we're going to talk about that hospital. Amongst the many valuable contributions provided by the Order of St. John and its volunteers was the St. John Ambulance Brigade Hospital in Étaples, France. And I am sorry for my horrible presentation of French words. My Polish accent comes out when I try and pronounce these things. In 1914, the Order approached the British War Office with the proposal to fund, staff, and operate a field hospital entirely at the Order's expense. The Order proposed a 520-bed hospital that the War Office was pretty quick to accept. The deal was that the War Office would supply the rations for staff and patients, fuel for any transport, and the wages for those enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps. The construction on the hospital began in the spring of 1915, and it was designed to be a complex made up of prefabricated huts, which were shipped from the UK to France. And by September 1915, the hospital was fully operational. It had 18 wards. 16 of those wards had 30 beds, and they also had 2 wards of 20 beds. The hospital was furnished in a way that it was clearly a St. John hospital. The beds had plaques above them with Maltese crosses, and all the blankets used had a big Maltese cross on them. And by 1918, the hospital expanded to 744 beds. So the photo I have here on this slide is of the St. John Ambulance Brigade Hospital and some of its staff. It had a nice big sign out front so you knew what it was. This is a view of the hospital. So you can see they were all kind of single level wooden buildings. And each of the different wards were attached by this wooden covered walkway. There was a garden in the middle for staff and patients to enjoy. And this is one of the wards. So I chose this picture because you can see that Maltese cross on all of the blankets. This hospital was a base clearing hospital, meaning it was part of the casualty evacuation chain. So it would be further back from the front line than the casualty clearing station. So essentially, if you were injured on the front line, you would be taken off, given first aid, moved to a casualty clearing station, and then taken further back from the front line to one of these base clearing hospitals. Base clearing hospitals would be generally fairly close to a railway line so that supplies and casualties could be brought in. And they were often close to a port so that servicemen could be evacuated from there back to England. The Brigade Hospital provided treatment, surgical support, and some degree of convalescence to patients before they were evacuated back to the UK or returned to their units. This hospital was staffed entirely by St. John Ambulance Brigade members. The first commandant was the Chief Commissioner of the Brigade, Colonel Sir James Clark, who was a Knight of Justice. In 1916, he was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel C.J. Trimble, who was also a Knight of Justice. The staff consisted of 17 medical officers and surgeons, a dental surgeon, a matron and assistant, a quartermaster and secretary, 53 trained nursing sisters, 24 VADs, 141 orderlies that were from the St. John Ambulance Brigade and were then organized into a provisional company of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Throughout the war, this hospital admitted mostly those who needed beds, so stretcher cases. Those who were classified as walking wounded would have been cared for elsewhere. This hospital would admit the most serious cases coming from the front lines, the men with the most severe injuries, and this ended up being a bit of a strain on the medical staff, having this constant convoy of seriously injured people coming through the hospital. The first casualties admitted to the Brigade Hospital arrived by train on September 7th, 1915 at 11:30 p.m. The convoy arrived from Luce with 57 stretcher cases. From then on, casualties would arrive in various quantities at all hours. At times, there were so many injured men in the hospital that they would overflow into the corridors on stretchers, makeshift mattresses, and trolleys. By the time the Battle of the Somme began in July 1916, the number of beds at the hospital had increased from 520 to 744. However, this was still not enough beds for the amount of patients being brought brought into the hospital. Sometimes the staff would get warning of incoming transports of the wounded, but if communications were down, patients would arrive unannounced, and the staff had to do their best to triage, admit, and treat patients. So I'll show you another picture of this. By all accounts, this hospital was known to be quite modern and was said to be one of the best equipped field hospitals. It had its own X-ray room. As you can see here, at the time, X-rays were quite bulky. So this was the X-ray room. This was the surgical suite. So the room, the kind of anteroom with the two beds on the side, was the anesthetic room, and then the two operating theaters. The Brigade Hospital was also equipped with an electrocardiograph machine. This was reportedly the first time an ECG was used in the field. ECGs were relatively new at the time, and their use was not fully accepted yet. The machines themselves were quite large and rudimentary in comparison to today's. If you look up some old pictures of them, they would also take up a large part of a room. The electrocardiograph at the Brigade Hospital was brought there by an Irish physician named Dr. John Elder McElwain. He had originally purchased it while working at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and then he brought it with him when he went to serve at the Brigade Hospital in Étampes. Dr. McElwain would head the cardiology department at the Brigade Hospital, as well as supervise 3 other wards. Under his supervision, every soldier coming through the hospital over the age of 40 and every soldier suspected of having heart problems was subjected to an electrocardiogram. In the early days of this hospital, they noticed that there was a large number of soldiers being admitted with complaints of chest pain, palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, and fatigue. This, at the time, came to be known as disordered action of the heart, or DAH. It was commonly caused by weakened heart valves or bacterial infections. Being diagnosed with DAH was not viewed as favorable by the government because it meant a lengthy and expensive stay in hospital, and it would often lead to discharge from the army. There was therefore a lot of pressure put on medical staff in the hospital system to downplay the significance of these symptoms and reclassify them or reevaluate them as effort syndrome caused by the stress of battle. So a soldier who had DAH would spend 6 months convalescing, whereas one diagnosed with effort syndrome only required 6 weeks before he could return to the front lines. Because of this, there were many arguments made against the value of ECGs in determining heart abnormality. It wasn't viewed as economical. However, based off of Dr. McElwain's notes and statistics, we can see that he didn't really give in to the government's pressure. By 1918, he had diagnosed 1,031 patients with disordered action of the heart. The majority of these patients had diseased heart valves. The treatment proposed by Dr. McElwain was a graduated exercise regime to improve heart function. And those who responded well got to return to the front lines, and those who did not returned to England and were medically discharged. Dr. McElwain also conducted research on the cardiology ward, making comparisons between patient presentations, their ECG results, and their diagnoses. And from that work, he wrote several scientific papers which showed the benefits of ECGs and contributed to their acceptance as diagnostic and monitoring devices. Okay, so we move on. You should know that The Brigade Hospital in Etaples was part of a larger military establishment. So it was near military training camps, it was near munitions depots, it was near a railway. Millions of troops would have passed through this area on their way to the front. And for these reasons, the area was subject to multiple air raids beginning in May 1918. The Brigade Hospital was first hit on May 19th and then again on May 31st. The bombings killed 16 people and produced 60 other casualties. So I have a slide up here from the bombing of May 19th. You can see the hospital from above. It's got the red crosses on the roofs denoting a hospital, and you can see some of the damaged wards. I have a passage from a book by a VAD at this hospital. The book is called Sisters of the Somme, and I think it describes the events quite well. By 10:30 p.m., the familiar droning of aircraft could be heard overhead once more. The bombers had returned. Yet again, a stunningly bright magnesium flare lit up the sky and all hell broke loose. Like incessant, deafening, rolling claps of thunder, an avalanche of bombs dropped on the Brigade Hospital. Earth-shattering explosions erupted from all directions. Walls shuddered and ceilings collapsed. The first large bomb had dropped without warning on the center of a medical ward. Sister Anne Bain, who was in charge of the ward on night duty, was killed instantly as she sat writing desk reports. 7 patients were also killed instantly. 3 orderlies who were desperately trying to save the remaining patients were killed outright by a second bomb. There was no time to get the occupants out of the ward. Wards were demolished and the operating theater windows shattered. The bombardment continued for 3 hours. The St. John Fire Brigade and orderlies rescued patients from the debris while nurses attended to the wounded. Many of the patients who could help did what they could to protect the helpless. And I'll just quickly escape this presentation to show you a quick video clip. So this was taken in the aftermath of that second bombing of the hospital. And you can see that the wooden buildings didn't stand much of a chance against the bombing. Not only were they bombed, but a lot of them caught fire as well. Just quickly fast forward here. So you can see some of the VADs in their white aprons and gray shirts walking around. The Red Cross vehicles were sent in to collect, to evacuate some of the patients. Trains were brought in to evacuate what they could evacuate. And this is a clip from a funeral of some of the staff who were killed in that. You can see the nurses and other personnel. Okay. Oops. We'll go back.
Sorry, Anna, you lost out of the presentation, so I think we missed a few of the slides you were just showing there. When you started talking about trains and trucks there, I think we lost it.
The video?
Yes, that's right. We didn't see any video.
Is it not screen sharing?
No, we're seeing your PowerPoint in like edit mode.
Oh, weird. Let me see if I can. Does that work?
Try playing the video, yeah, without it on full screen.
There it is. Okay. So what I said earlier, you can see just how destroyed it was. And there's some of the nurses that I pointed out there. And that funeral taking place. Okay. We'll go back here. Okay, am I showing my slide again?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Okay. So the bombing of the area continued all the way into August 1918, but the bombing that took place in May was effectively what ended the hospital's ability to operate. When the German pilots who were part of that mission to bomb the area were questioned, they pretty well said, well, you put a hospital next to all of these targets that we wanted to bomb. So an outcome from this event was the recommendation that hospitals not be placed so close to strategic targets such as military camps, bridges, railway junctions, and so on. So by the time the hospital was decommissioned, it had treated roughly 35,000 patients. It provided a very high standard of care, and it did some really cutting edge medical procedures and research for that time. There were advances made in surgery and x-ray techniques, and several influential medical papers were written on cardiology, on bacteriology. The Order of St. John had every reason to be proud of what it had accomplished at this hospital. Questions? I see there are many things in the chat.
It's 99% people just telling you that they can't see the video.
Good.
Dave Valentine added in here that in World War I, all the regiments with bands had their bandsmen double as stretcher barriers in the communication runners. So the bandsmen would actually be moving the frontline wounded to the rear to the casualty collection points, and then they'd be moved further to the rear to the field hospitals, and that's likely where they came into the care of the VADs. You might be able to message Carrie afterwards just with some links to where you found the pictures. She was asking that. And that's all the questions we have there so far.
Okay, I'll quickly answer Carrie. So there were actually pamphlets that were printed from that time that would show the hospital. So those ones I took of one that I have, and it was sent essentially as Christmas cards. I found one on eBay. And the answer to the person asking about the book I used was called Sisters of the Somme, written by Penny Starns. It's written from the point of view of VADs. It took a lot of diaries and journal entries, and it is a really interesting read if this is a topic that interests you. So I will post, I am actually done. Nick is going to present next. Those were kind of the three main areas I wanted to talk about. I'll put up my resources here and I'll quickly touch on them. So if you want a general history of St. John Ambulance in Canada, I recommend The Maple Leaf and the White Cross by Christopher McCreery, and also The White Cross in Canada from 1883 to 1983 by Strome Galloway. If you are looking specifically for material on VADs, I recommend Linda Quiney's work. This Small Army of Women is a fabulous book that you can pick up in most local bookstores. Assistant Angels is a paper that she wrote. It is accessible online. Again, Penny Starr's Sisters of the Somme is an excellent book, very well researched about St. John Ambulance VADs and the St. John Ambulance Hospital in France. And then a lot of the stuff I pulled locally was from the Daily Colonist and Times Colonist archives. I'm certain that if you pulled up archives from whatever city you are in, you will find St. John material from that time. The commandants of the field of the Brigade Hospital in France also sent weekly reports back to the order or to St. John's Gate in the UK. Those reports have been digitized and published on the Museum of St. John's website. If you are interested in these weekly briefings from the hospital, check out that link there. And then the Order of St. John published magazines called First Aid. And the section from 1914 to 1918 will give you a lot of stuff about the work that St. John did at this time. Okay, so that's it for me. I'll stop sharing my screen and let Nicholas talk. We're going to present to you someone who served in the First World War from St. John.
Thanks very much, Anna. I'll see if I can make my screen sharing work here. I cannot share my screen while other participant is sharing. I need you to give up sharing.
I will stop sharing. There you go.
There we go.
I've given up my power.
Share screen, desktop to share. And I'm now sharing my screen and I'm gonna play. And can someone just tell me in chat, do you guys just see a big St. John roundel there?
See you, no problem.
Fantastic, thank you. So guys, my name is Nick Hume. I think a lot of you guys know me. I'm a provincial staff officer here in BC. I do a lot of my work with Division 176 here in Victoria, of which Anna is the superintendent. I don't know if she mentioned that in her introduction or not. And I should say as well, before we go on, thank you, Anna, because that was actually a fantastic presentation. I always learn a lot when I listen to you talk about this stuff, so thank you. Today, I'm going to be presenting the story of one of our members from our very first division here in Victoria, Victoria Central Nursing Division 34. I don't have a lot of information to go into great depth in Nursing Division 34 because we have unfortunately lost a lot of our records of the actual division itself. I do think it's important to recognize that Nursing Division 34 was formed in 1917 and disbanded in 1921, and then it was another 14 years before the men got their act together and created their own ambulance division in 1935. And despite the fact that a lot of our St. John historians have sort of forgotten about Division 34, these ladies were doing this 18 years before the gentleman got around to it. A brief caveat, I am not a historian. I'm not a professional historian. I'm not even really an amateur historian. I'm a paramedic who has a degree in anthropology and is really interested in St. John history. So please take what I say here with a grain of salt. If there are any errors in either information or procedure, they are very much my own. So the lady we're going to be talking about today, Dorothy Pearson Twist, I just want to take you through basically what the life of a typical VAD member would have been like. And we're going to start very early on with Dorothy's early life. No, Mike, I don't play historian on TV. So Dorothy Pearson Twist was born on December 27th, 1884 in Prescott in the United Kingdom. She was baptized a couple of months after that on February 4th, 1885 at the town parish in Prescott. This is an actual photo from about that time period of what the Prescott Parish Church looked like at the time. Dorothy's parents were Pearson Gill Twist and Julia Alexandra Twist. Prescott itself was an industrial town. It specialized in watches, earthenware pottery, and insulated wire cables, of all things. Dorothy's older sister, Phyllis, ended up becoming a midwife later in life. Pearson Gill Twist's business and family business was in pottery and woolen manufacturing. Pearson Gill Twist was a very successful businessman locally. He owned the local earthenware pottery facility. He was also a very enthusiastic sportsman who founded several local sports leagues, including, of all things, the Prescott Cables Football Club, who still play today, 100 and something years, 130 years after they were founded. And he was also an avid cyclist. So he may at some point have been the president of the local bicycle club. I don't know if you guys can see that highlight down there at the bottom. But in 1878, we have indications that he was doing that. What I'm trying to get at with all this is that Dorothy came from a fairly wealthy, influential, and actively engaged in the community family. This was not a working class family where everyone was working day in and day out to make ends meet. Pearson Gill Twist was quite a successful gentleman in his own right. So Dorothy herself, born in 1884, baptized in 1885. She found her skill in typewriting, and we know this from a few censuses from the United Kingdom. In 1901, at age 16, Dorothy was listed as a pupil teacher / school on the census of England. We're not quite clear if pupil teacher means that she was actually working as a tutor, or if she was a pupil being taught by someone. I need someone with more historical knowledge of the censuses to explain that to me. By the age of 26, though, 10 years later, 1911, we have some indication that Dorothy was both successful as a typist. She'd become a shorthand and typewriting clerk at the University of Liverpool, a few kilometers away from where she had grown up. And she was living with her Aunt Maud, who was 56 years old, and it was the two women in a 5-room house, presumably fairly close to the university. I find this fascinating because in 1911, I feel like two women living alone together would have been, at age 16, she would have already been in the workforce. You might be correct if she was from a working class family. There's some degree of debate over this, and this is after consulting with a number of period historians as to whether she would have actually still been studying or not. She might have still been receiving some degree of education. It's interesting to see that by the age of 26, she's living with her Aunt Maud in a 5-room house with just the two ladies there and no apparent men anywhere to be seen. In April of 1911, so the same year as the census, in fact, about a week after the census, Dorothy's younger brother Hugh, a mechanic, emigrated to Canada and settled in Victoria, crossed from Liverpool to Halifax on board the RMS Hesperian, with 2,413 of his closest friends on board. This is an actual drawing of the Hesperian. I cannot imagine a ship of this size with 2,400 people plus crew on board. It does not sound like it would have been a very comfortable voyage. The Twist family engaged in what was called serial emigration. So one person would come out, another person would come out, another person would come out. So about a year after her brother Dorothy departed Liverpool, bound from Montreal, Quebec, aboard the SS Victorian, a little bit more comfortable. This ship had only 1,281 people on board. Dorothy herself was booked into a second-class cabin. Interestingly enough, she maintained her what I am interpreting as her independent streak, and came out here all on her own, leaving from Liverpool, coming across to land in Montreal, and then crossing Canada from Montreal to Victoria, again by herself. These are her actual passenger manifests. So this is her actual passenger manifest, and you can see Twist Dorothy just down here. The immigration cards are not hers, they're just examples that I found online. But people would have been required to go through a civil examination, a medical examination, and receive customs clearance before they could come into Canada. So Dorothy would have come in through Montreal. She would have crossed Canada by train to Vancouver and then on to Victoria. At the time, of course, the ferry service from Vancouver to Victoria was operated by Canadian Pacific Railways. So it would have been a railway operated ferry boat she came across on. And she settled at number 86 Dallas Road. For those of you who are in Victoria, 86 Dallas Road is still standing. It is a designated heritage building right now. At the time that Dorothy moved in here, it was only 5 years old. So this was, again, 1912 that Dorothy came across. Now, Dorothy, when she got to Victoria, we don't know We don't know a huge amount about how she landed this job, but she found work very quickly as a stenographer or a clerk at the Imperial Bank of Canada, about a 30-minute walk from her home. And we know this from what are called the Henderson's directories, which were city directories at the time. So you can see down here, Dorothy Twist, Steno, Imperial Bank at 1301 government. So that's the 1913, that bottom was the 1913 Henderson's directory, which would have been compiled in late 1912. So she would have found that employment fairly quickly after arriving. We see the same thing in the 1914, I believe, Henderson's. I think that's the 1914, and then the 1915 as well. And you also see her brother Hugh there as listed as a machinist working for the Victoria Machinery Depot and living at 760 Topaz Avenue. Dorothy stayed at 86 Dallas Road for her entire time here. She would have walked, as I said, about a 30-minute walk to work every morning from 86 Dallas Road to 1301 Government Street, where she was employed as a stenographer. For those of you who are wondering what 1301 Government Street is now, it is in fact a Starbucks. It was for the longest time a Starbucks. That may have recently closed. I haven't verified that. The building that you see in this photo is not the original building that was there in the 1800s. This building was constructed in 1946. I do not have permission or access to use the photos of the building from the 1800s yet. I hope to rectify that in future versions of this presentation. So. About a year afterwards, on April 4th of 1913, the rest of the family, Pearson, Julia, Phyllis, the soon-to-be midwife, the then midwife, Jeffrey, Cicely, and of course Aunt Maud, board the SS Corsican from Liverpool and come over to Halifax. They take the CPR train to Victoria, just as Dorothy and Hugh did. They list their future occupation here, and you can see down here, there's the Twist family coming across. They list their future occupation as farmer. We're not quite sure why, but there's a few possibilities. Possibility one is that Pearson is 62 years old, is perhaps looking for a quiet, retired life in the country after years of work. The other possibility is that there may have been land grants at that time for people who expressed that they were going to become farmers. Again, another loose end that I haven't had an opportunity to follow up on with local historians. The Twists settled in the countryside, somewhere between Shawnigan Lake and Cobble Hill, about 50 kilometers north of Victoria. We understand that they did stay in one place for a year or two before settling into a more permanent residence up there, and then living in the area for quite some time afterwards. Dorothy, of course, remained in Victoria and kept her employment as a stenographer with the Imperial Bank. So about a year after the Twists arrived in Victoria, Dorothy's still working as a stenographer. Europe isn't looking so great. Armies are mobilizing. Britain's great first fleet puts to sea, fully manned for some destination not yet disclosed. Europe generally fears a great war. This is the front page of the Daily Colonist on Thursday, July the 30th, 1914. Of course, we know what happened 5 or 6 days later on August 5th, 1914. The British Empire declares war against Germany and World War I officially kicks off. So what does that mean for Dorothy? What does that mean for everyone else? Well, as Anna expressed in fairly great detail earlier, St. John Ambulance immobilized very, very rapidly to organize volunteers. So that last headline here, this is August 5th, 1914. On the same day, 3 members of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, a philanthropic group that did sort of social or service work, women who did service work, Mrs. Charles E. Dolly Wilson, so Mrs. Dorothy Wilson, but she's married to Charles, so we call her, of course, by her husband's first name. Mrs. Beckworth and Miss Monroe met to discuss teaching first aid classes to aid the war effort. 2 days later, they have 150 students enrolled, and classes begin in the Temple building in downtown Victoria. I believe, but I have not yet verified, I believe the Temple building still stands on Lower Fort Street. close to the water, I think. There's a couple of buildings. I need to verify that, pardon me. By October 2nd, so about 2 months later, 267 women and 39 men had completed their training in first aid to the injured. So things got moving fairly quickly. By 1915, St. John Ambulance Association expanded classes to include home nursing. And for those of you who are joining us from Duncan tonight, I don't know if I see any Duncanites in here. Congratulations, guys. You guys got things moving before anyone else and formed the province's 1st Brigade Division. I don't have the date of formation for the Duncan Division, but I do know that it was in 1915. I seem to recall early 1915. So what does Dorothy do? Well, as Anna talked about a little bit, we have the first aid to the injured and the home nursing courses. As you can see here, these are some fantastic graphics. This first aid to the injured that you're looking at here was from 1913, 1914. I see Glenn Trafford from 1054 here saying, yeah, good work, guys. And then, of course, the home nursing course as well. This photo that I just popped up, the most recent one here, the large hamper for ambulance station and railway purposes. Of course, the last few pages of these manuals are typically advertisements for products that you can purchase to provide first aid with, and to also financially support the association by purchasing from them. Again, another example of men carrying a casualty on a stretcher improvised out of jackets. Incidentally, this style of stretcher made out of jackets is exactly the same as the one still taught in wilderness first aid courses today. And if you pay attention to the triangular bandage diagrams, then the second image, you'll note that those are also exactly the same as the ones that are taught in, or very, very similar to the ones that are taught in your first aid courses these days. The women, of course, were taught how to do home nursing stuff, including things like how to deploy and use bedpans. There's obviously a lot more to this. This is not a comprehensive discussion of what was covered in these courses, but just to give you guys an idea. So first aid. So Dorothy was one of hundreds of women who took home nursing and first aid to the injured courses. She took her first aid to the injured course in late 1915, where she was taught by Dr. A.B. Hudson. All of the first aid to the injured courses were, of course, taught by a physician at the time. And she passed her final exam on November 9th of 1915. We know this because back in those days, passing your first aid course was considered such a significant event that St. John actually published the list of successful candidates who passed their exams, and also gave everyone directions on, in many cases, on where and when they could pick up their certificates. Yes, today, 105 years, well, yes, it is actually, that's a good point. I had not actually put that together at all. So Dorothy passed her first aid to the injured course. The course would have been, as Anna talked about, in either 5 or 6 lectures. It was about this time that they went from 5 to 6 lessons in the first aid to the injured. I'd have to actually check to see if it was still 5 or if it was 6 at this time. And then, of course, she moved on to home nursing. So sometime in early 1916, Dorothy completed her home nursing training. The course was again taught by Dr. A.B. Hudson. And on May 5th, of 1916, Dorothy's home nursing certificate completion was published in the paper. This gives me a little bit of a kick right here. The young women who took their home nursing certificate at the YWCA are directed to the entrance to the YWCA at Douglas and Courtney Streets. It's worth noting that here in Victoria, at least, that was a different entrance for the men and the women. And the men's entrance to the YMCA was around the corner on a different part of the building, so that the two genders or sexes, or whatever the term you were using back then, would not intermingle inappropriately. Dorothy's certificate arrived on May 5th, and she probably never picked it up. She had deployed as a VAD several weeks earlier, and by this time was already in the United Kingdom. So Dorothy traveled back to Europe aboard the SS Cal, and I should point out as well as we talk about this, that would suggest that Dorothy had basically gotten her home nursing and been out the door faster than her certificate could show up. That suggests that she was probably quite keen to get herself over to Europe to help. So Dorothy traveled back to Europe aboard the SS California, leaving from New York and arriving in Liverpool on April 20th. So she's in Liverpool 2 weeks before her certificate even shows up in Victoria. This is not a photo of Dorothy. This is a photo of women in 1913 aboard the SS California. So just to give you an idea of what the period dress was like and what the California looked like. It's also important to note that the SS California is not the same ship as the SS Californian, which was involved in abandoning the survivors of the Titanic disaster. They're different ships, different names. More information on the SS California leaving from New York. A couple of people have asked why Dorothy would go down to New York, as the U.S. had only just joined the war, or pardon me, had they just joined the war? Either had just joined the war or hadn't yet joined the war. Traveling by ship from a U.S. port was generally considered much safer than a Commonwealth port. I think this was a year before they joined the war, actually. Pardon me. But this was much safer than from a Commonwealth port because the ships were not at risk of being torpedoed by the Germans. So, despite her new first aid and home nursing training, Dorothy's clerical skills were quite unusual at the time. To be an exceptional typist was not the most common thing. She was assigned to the Burn Bureau of the Central Prisoner of War Committee, where she was sent to become a secretary to Lady Evelyn Grant Duff. Now, Lady Evelyn is notable for a few things. First off, well, primarily Lady Evelyn is notable for founding and operating the Burn Bread Bureau, which shipped bread to POWs in Germany. By the time Dorothy arrived, the Burn Bureau was shipping 6,400 loaves of bread to POWs every day, with over 100 clerical staff tracking the bread. They actually had an entire clerical division. Dorothy's card says Secretary to Lady Grant Duff, Burn Bureau, which makes me think that perhaps Dorothy was in fact her actual secretary and not just part of the clerical pool. I have no way of determining if that's actually the case or not. I haven't been able to find any records to indicate one way or the other. It's quite possible that she was just another member of the clerical pool, or she might have been Lady Grant Duff's personal secretary. Between May 1915 and 1917, the Burn Bread Bureau dispatched just under 4 million loaves of bread. And following the war, Lady Grant Duff was made a Dame of Grace of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem for her work operating the Burn Bread Bureau and feeding literally hundreds of thousands of POWs who would likely have otherwise starved or been malnourished. So we know Dorothy was here for some time. Sometime in mid-1917, so about a year later, Dorothy's reassigned to VAD, to the VAD division, the VAD London Paddington division, pardon me. That was Division L268 or London 268. There are some sources on the internet that say L/268 was Dorothy's serial number. It was not. It was the division that she was attached to in London. We believe that means that she was actually sent back to London. We're not sure. Her British Red Cross service card says she was assigned from February 1917 to August 1917. Right, as you guys can see, same excerpt from her service card right here. January 17, she left Burn. February to August 1917, clerical work at Central Prisoner of War Committee. Now, the society page of the Vancouver Daily Sun in July lists her as a British Columbia person who has recently arrived in London. So what was going on between February and July, I'm not sure. Was the newspaper late in reporting this? It's possible. Or was she doing something else for those months? We don't know. What we do know, as my clicker stops working here, what we do know is that later in 1917, presumably at the end of her time here. Sorry guys, as I click through here. Presumably at the end of her August 1917 stint as listed on her card, so August 1917, Dorothy comes back to Victoria. We know that we've been told that, or found some sources to indicate that her return was the result of an illness. And we know that, or we think that her returning while she was ill is unlikely. It's quite a strenuous and long journey. It's not the sort of thing that you would undertake if you had a significant or serious illness. What is possible, though, is that many volunteers, many VAD members and other volunteers were deemed ill from exhaustion and were sent home for a period of recuperation to recover from their strenuous efforts. And this might have been the case with Dorothy. We just don't know. Certainly, Central Nursing Division 34, as Anna talked about a little bit, had been busy around Victoria during the war. And in May of 1918, that we find that Dorothy had apparently recuperated or recovered from her illness and joined Division 34, and had in fact impressed them enough to be among 3 women who volunteered to deploy overseas. The other 2 women were Miss Ethel Clark and Miss Florence Bailey. So we know that's from May of 1918, May 3rd of 1918. On May 5th, I believe, May 15th, 14th, 13th, somewhere there, a couple days before May 15th, there's actually a newspaper reference. This is the sort of thing that was done in the time, during which Mrs. Sampson, one of the nursing officers of the division, hosted a goodbye party or goodbye tea party for the nurses who were deploying overseas, where they were tendered a farewell at the home of Miss Curtis Sampson on Newport Avenue. That's in Oak Bay, for those of you who don't know Victoria that well, who was the first nursing officer of the Victoria Division. Among those assembled to bid the departing nurses Godspeed were Mrs. Chaz. Chaz is just an abbreviation of Charles Wilson. Mrs. Dolly Wilson, the district superintendent of the nursing division, and a large company of the members. So this is you know, a goodbye bash. I see a question: did Dorothy and others cover their own Atlantic crossing traveling costs? I don't think so. If they were going over as VADs, Lisanne, if they were going like Dorothy's first trip over there, I'm not clear because we don't have an indication of if she went over there and then volunteered as a VAD once she got there, or if she somehow volunteered here first. We don't have a record either way. So if she went over there herself and then walked into the Red Cross and said she wanted to volunteer, she would have had to pay her own way. If she volunteered here first and got sent over, she would have probably had her fees covered. Either way, don't forget that Dorothy comes from a family of means. I don't anticipate that the cost of a couple of crossings would have been a huge barrier to her if she'd been able to ask her parents for a few dollars or a few pounds. So the crossing for these 3 VADs was a bit of an ordeal. First, they went to Toronto for a few weeks, where, of course, the Society page records them as the Vancouver Daily World Society page records them as being part of a large party of young ladies from Western Canada that have been spending a week or 2 in Toronto awaiting orders before proceeding overseas for service in England or France. The members of the party being accepted VAD nurses of the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. They got our name wrong back then, and they continue to do it now. The young ladies from Vancouver are so-and-so and so-and-so. From Victoria, there are Miss Dorothy Twist, Miss Ethel Clark, and Miss Florence Bailey. So we have the 3 of them in Toronto. We know that as they made their way across the Atlantic, there was a great deal of concern. The Llandovery Castle, which is a famous casualty in World War I with many, many people lost at sea, had been recently torpedoed, and there was great concern that the nurses' ship might also be torpedoed. So, of course, the first thing they do when they arrive in the UK is to wire home, and on July 2nd, Dolly Wilson, Lady Superintendent of Central Nursing Division 34 in Victoria, received word of their received word of their safe arrival. So July 2nd, we know they've arrived in the UK. Not quite clear whether that's in Liverpool or whether that wire was sent from London or from somewhere else, but I would suspect it would be one of the first things they do when they hit the ground over there. So Dorothy was assigned to work as a VAD at Frensham Hill Military Hospital in Surrey, far from the front, and probably considered quite a safe assignment. You know, some of the VADs who were being deployed over to Etaples, you've heard about what the bombing was like in Etaples, the fact that this was not a safe place to necessarily be. Frensham Hill was a convalescent hospital with soldiers recuperating from their injuries. The hospital at the time was under the command of Sister Dunbabin of Liverpool, who had underneath her 2 nurses and 10 VADs. I forgot to put it on a point on the slide, but I believe they had upwards of 60 or 80 beds at one point for that number. This is a photo of Frensham Hill. Frensham is now a very exclusive private school. The building still stands. You can still go and visit. This is what it looked like around World War I, either shortly before or shortly after. I don't have a date on this photo. This is what a number of the huts expanded down below the actual main building looked like. This number of huts suggests a much larger hospital than what the written sources that I can find indicate, and I might just be mixing up some dates there. Again, I'm still working on teasing apart some of this. So Frensham Military Hospital was very close to Frensham Common Military Camp, where healthy returning soldiers and also soldiers waiting to deploy would rest and train. This is what could Nicholas's volume be increased a little bit? I can try and talk louder for you. I don't have a way to increase the speaker volume. So Frensham Hill Military Hospital was near Frensham Common Military Camp, where healthy returning soldiers would rest and train, and also soldiers waiting to deploy might be stationed. This is a photo of the camp as it existed. The camp also had a segregation camp to quarantine recently returned soldiers at. So they did have Spanish flu in the camp. Spanish flu was a challenge for them, and they had, as we are doing now, they would with COVID, they would quarantine or segregate returning troops for a period of time to try and prevent Spanish flu from entering the hospital. So here's a photo of a number of the patients at Frensham Hill Military Hospital posing for a group photo out front. The same month that Dorothy arrived, the hospital in a nearby camp was seeing a fairly significant rise in flu cases. So again, Dorothy landed on July 2nd, pardon me. By October, we know that the entire camp at nearby had been quarantined due to a massive outbreak of Spanish flu, with over 2,000 people infected. This is a photo of one of the wards at Frensham Hill Military Hospital. This is actually the ballroom of the mansion that was turned into the hospital. And if it wasn't obvious from the photos, guys, Frensham Hill was a historic manor house that was converted into a hospital during the war. So within a month of her arrival at Frensham, Dorothy contracted pneumonia influenza. This is almost certainly, I think it's very likely to be the same Spanish flu that was running rampant among the returning troops. There is, of course, no way to verify that or to confirm that, but it seems to be a very logical inference. Dorothy's parents, Dorothy was unwell enough that her parents in Shawnigan Lake were wired, informing them that their daughter was seriously ill. And we know that they received that wire, probably a telegram, sometime around mid or late September of 1918, probably on or around September 20th. So what happened? Well, Dorothy died on September 26th of 1918. She succumbed to her influenza pneumonia, and Dorothy passed away. Some of the media coverage from the time gives you an idea of how significant an event this was. Dorothy was Canada's first VAD who was killed while overseas. There's the Victoria Daily Times has perhaps the best lead here. The Grim Reaper has exacted his first toll on the band of brave women and girls who have gone overseas from Victoria as members of that vast army of VAD workers. The Daily Colonist just more simply and more soberly records that the first casualty in the ranks of the VAD nurses who have gone overseas from the Victoria Central Nursing Division has occurred. And Miss Dorothy Twist, who left Victoria last May, died at Frensham Military Hospital, England on September 26th. The death of a VAD was, based on the media coverage here, was a fairly significant event. This hadn't happened before, and people were I think, a little bit rattled by it. The Daily Province published a notification in Vancouver notifying the many friends in Vancouver of Mr. and Mrs. Twist of Shawnigan will regret to learn of the death by pneumonia of their daughter Dorothy Twist. As I mentioned, Dorothy's death was Canada's first VAD casualty in the war. Her VAD card does list her as died from pneumonia on the 26th. These are her British Red Cross VAD cards. Perhaps unusually, this strikes a lot of people as unusual. Dorothy was buried with full military honors within a day or two of her death. This was published on September 29th, 3 days after her death. So she would have had to have been buried on the 27th or the 28th. She was recorded in the British Journal of Nursing on page 212 a week later as having received full military honors. And she is buried at Aldershot Military Cemetery, just a few kilometers away from Frensham. It's about 5 kilometers northeast of Frensham. And if you notice, you'll see the British Red Cross and Order of St. John insignia at the top of the tombstone there. So in terms of remembrance, Dorothy's name is recorded in the Order of St. John, the Grand Priory of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem in England's Roll of Honor. The Roll of Honor is housed at the Museum of the Order in London, and Dorothy is one of the 22 members of the organization who were considered killed on active duty. She is listed as an ambulance sister, Twist, ambulance sister DP. We think that the ambulance sister reference here has caused some confusion. Ambulance sister is different than nursing sister, and some historical sources refer to Dorothy as a nursing sister, which she was, of course, not. She was a VAD, pardon me. Of course, in the family's hometown of Cobble Hill, and we think, we're not sure, but we believe that when Dorothy returned back home in 1917, that she likely stayed with her parents. There's no other record of her being anywhere else. So she probably moved back home with the parents. And she's listed as her place of permanent residence is listed as Cobble Hill or Shawnigan Lake. So of course, Cobble Hill, when they erected their cenotaph, made sure to memorialize Dorothy. A few years later, when the Governor General visited, the Governor General personally references Dorothy during His Excellency's visit. His Excellency made special reference to Miss Dorothy Twist, a nursing officer whose name is inscribed on the memorial. And then, of course, the local church as well. A couple of years later, the local church, All Saints Church, commemorates a lectern along with Dorothy's name, and 5 other names of local parishioners who had been killed on active duty. The church is now gone. All Saints closed a number of years ago. I haven't been able to locate the lectern yet. Dorothy was posthumously awarded a British War Medal for her service. We have her name listed as a VAD. You'll notice that her name is in red. I believe the red references that this is a posthumous award. And you'll notice the stamp at the bottom indicating that this is a Red Cross and St. John VAD page out of the reference book. And Dorothy is the only woman commemorated at both the Cobble Hill and the Duncan cenotaphs. And I think it's particularly telling. The Cobble Hill cenotaph epitaph reads, "To the loyal sons and daughter of this district who fell in the war 1914 to 1918." It would have been very easy for the people putting up the cenotaph, especially given the era, given that this is pre-Persons Act in Canada, to simply say to the loyal sons of this district, and then list Dorothy's name. And I've always thought that it was particularly telling that they took the time and paid enough attention to include the daughter in the epitaph. So this is a photo of Dorothy. This is one of the only good photos of Dorothy that we had. Her serial number was not L268. Her VAD serial number was 82T118. She was attached to Victoria Central Nursing Division 34. And of course, she lived from December 27, 1884 to September 26, 1918, dying at the age of 33 at Frensham Hill Military Hospital, buried at Aldershot. There's a lot of sources that have gone into this. I see Nancy saying, it's interesting that only Dorothy's first name is listed on the cenotaph. All the others show initials only. There's quite a few other places that reference her, sometimes as Twist DP, sometimes as Dorothy P. Twist, sometimes as Dorothy Twist. Dorothy P. Twist is the most common, but there might be a standard there that I'm not aware of in terms of what they chose. A number of sources were helpful for this. This is, I hate to admit to this is not a complete list of the sources and references that I used doing this research. I am hoping to turn this into a more substantial body of research over the next year or so, and have a more properly curated reference list included afterwards. I'd like to say a particular thanks to Anna Stefik, who actually found Dorothy's name at first and got me really interested in her. Dr. Linda Quiney for her not many, but a very long phone call during which I asked her what I'm sure were a number of inane questions, and local historian Sherry Robinson, and a gentleman named Chris Shepherd over in the UK, and of course Mike Dussault locally, and Texada Island Heritage Society, who helped out with some backstory on the Twist family as well, and then everyone else listed here. Does anyone have any questions? I see Samsung Galaxy Tabby saying thank you. You're welcome, Samsung. I'm not sure who that is, but I'm glad that you enjoyed this or took something from it. And I agree, Dorothy was a very brave young woman. I can't quite wrap my head around what it would be like to be in her shoes, making those decisions and going in those places. So, if anyone has any questions, please ask them now.
Just while people are typing up there, I just want to say thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I know it's a little bit of a deviation from our usual, but I think understanding our history, especially in the context of Remembrance Day coming up this week, is really important. I'm just going to take that brief plug to mention, I know a lot of the time St. John Ambulance is heavily involved in Remembrance Day ceremonies, The Legion is having a tough time this year, especially because a lot of places aren't able to sell poppies, and they've got very few people who are comfortable doing poppy fund duties. So it might be worth considering making a donation to the Legion. As well, coming up next week, we've got Dr. Chima back talking about medical topics, a very interesting presenter who has a real history of just amazing presentations that we really hope everybody is able to come out for. And thank you all for coming out. We will have a video of this posted to our YouTube channel sometime this week. See a few more questions here. I'll let Nick pick up.
Sure. Really fast, Dave. I'll say I'm gonna try, and if you can get me the recording of this, I'm gonna try and get this up and online actually even tonight or tomorrow, just so people have a chance to look at it over Remembrance Day. Is there a Division 34 currently? No, no, Glenn, there's not. Division 34 was disbanded after World War I in 1921, and it was 14 years after that, in July of 1935, that number 65 Ambulance Division was formed here in Victoria. So no, Division 34 is long gone. Unfortunately, we've got lots of our original records from Division 65 and 61 and all these other divisions. We don't have very much from Division 34. So, Carrie, I'd love to hear about, maybe you can drop Anna a line to put us all in touch. Anna's email's up on the screen right now. I'd love to hear about you recreating the World War I VAD uniform. That would be absolutely fascinating to hear about. The question, was it thought strange to be unmarried? I don't have a good answer for that. Again, I'm not a historian of the era. Having said that, it's certainly, there was certainly a shortage of eligible bachelors at the time because they were all off busy fighting in the war and getting killed. And so I do understand that there were significantly more single women than there might have been at other points of time. Looking at the passenger manifests for the ships coming across the Atlantic, the men were significantly outnumbered by the women coming from Europe to North America. So it might not have been that unusual, but I don't have a better answer for you. I see thanks from the 17 members of Division 518 in snowy Kamloops. Is it snowing for you guys, Andy and Shirley? Oh, geez. I won't tell you what the weather's doing here. You'll be really upset. I see Mike Hoskinson saying, my great aunt Essie lost her husband and 2-year-old daughter to the Spanish flu. I'm sorry to hear that, Mike. As I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware, the Spanish flu was particularly notable for striking down otherwise young and healthy people. A lot of people in their 20s and 30s who would otherwise be considered in good health were particularly susceptible. I see a handful of thanks here. The women had to be unmarried because if they're married, they had duties to husband and family. Had to be, I'm not sure if you're saying they had to be unmarried because of, so I think there was a certain extent, Carrie, a shortage of men as well. I'm not quite sure because Dorothy in particular, Dorothy was 26 before she left the UK to come to Canada, left England to come to Canada. And that, that was before the war had kicked off. So I don't have a good explanation for why she remained unmarried, whether it was by choice or out of some sort of other reason. I'm not sure. I see Mike saying great aunt Essie never remarried. I'm just reading these out as well for the recording because the YouTube recording, of course, doesn't catch all the chat stuff. Rebecca's saying it's snowing in Penticton at Div 983. I'm going to continue to not tell you guys about the weather here. Anna's saying these women have also had the liberty to pursue higher education and jobs, very much an upper and middle class phenomenon. Yeah. So I don't know why specifically Dorothy remained unmarried. Certainly her sisters, Phyllis and Cicely, both married. Phyllis, the midwife, actually ended up marrying a gentleman named William Kirkness and moving to Texada Island off the coast of Comox with William, where They ran the local general store or hardware store, which burned down 3 times in I think 5 or 6 years or something like that. And they raised a family out there on Texada. For those of you who know Texada is not a large place. Cicely remained in Duncan and ended up marrying I believe an Air Force member in World War II. I don't have my family tree in front of me right now, so. Do we have any more questions, queries before we get out of here?
All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your night.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Good evening.